You have a hard body you love and want to use. You have a chassis you love and want to use, but the two wheelbases don't match. What do? You could change the wheelbase of the chassis to match the body, but you bought that chassis for a reason and you want to keep the stock geometry and wheelbase the same. So that only leaves you with one option, and that's to change the wheelbase of the body. In the shop right now, we've got a job that's just this situation. The customer wants to put a vintage Gremlin body on an SCX-102 chassis, but doesn't want to change the wheelbase. Here's the vintage Gremlin body that we need to change the wheelbase on. You can see we've already done a lot of the modifications to the front clip, and now we need to turn our attention to the rear fenders. With the body on the chassis, you can see the issue is way oversized cutouts that need to be moved back. Not a problem. I just need to create our own custom fenders, and I'm going to show you just how to do it. Let's get started by first removing the original fender flares. I start with a sanding drum using the silver painted area as a guide. I carefully remove material up to just short of the silver paint and finish by hand, first with coarse grit paper and then moving on to medium grit. I leave some cross-hatching from the sanding and a beveled edge around the cutout, so at a later stage when we add body filler, it has a good surface to adhere to. But now I need to fill the original fender cutout so I can start to create our own. I'm going to do this with styrene, so I'll roughly trace the area I'll be filling with a marker onto the styrene. I increase the tracing to give me some wiggle room and cut out the patch panel. After notching it to fit around the windows, I check for fitment and then transfer this shape to another piece of styrene that will be used later for the other side. With CA glue, I draw a bead around the cutout. When gluing the patch panel, it's very important to get a solid uniform bond. I don't want any flex between the patch and the body, or it could get cracks in the body filler later down the road. So I make sure and use a liberal amount of thin CA, allowing it to bleed down between the patch and the body, and while applying pressure from the back, use accelerator to set the glue. Now I need to start to create our own cutouts and fender flares. Using measurements from the wheel and tire combo that's gonna be on this vehicle, I 3D print a set of flares. I can use these flares as a framework or backbone for the new cutouts. But first I need to figure out where our new fender cutouts need to go. And I start by putting the body on the chassis and using a right angle to mark the center of the new cutouts. I've extended the body line I used for the front fenders all the way back and make a mark on the center of the new flare. Now I have all the marks I'll need to mount the fender flares from. With everything marked, I can start to glue the fender flare in place. I start by using CA glue to attach the back bottom point of the fender flare. The front of the flare is going to need to be brought out to the same plane as the rest of the body. You can see the gap here. I simply use some styrene as spacers to get it where it needs to be and glue it in place. That's got the bottom edges taken care of, but because of the curve of the body, the flat fender flare sticks way out and doesn't contour to the body. It's super stiff, but with a little heat, I can form it just how I need it. Once again, liberal amounts of CA to glue it in place. Once everything's fully dry, I can start the fun part, and that's the body filler. I use U-POL's Dolphin Glaze, part number UP0714. It's a high-quality finished glaze that's easy to sand and work with. Like most all body fillers, it comes in two parts, the putty or glaze itself and hardener. It takes very little hardener in the mixture, and I make sure to stir and fold it together thoroughly. And I start filling. I don't want to go too thick. I want to cover and fill the whole surface, but I'll be using many layers, so I concentrate on pulling a thin layer of filler out past the points it's needed. The idea is to sand the filler back into the shape of the body. To clarify, I want to make sure and add a thin layer of filler out into the body, so when I start removing filler back towards the shape of the body, I have filler to remove it and not just dig straight into the body. Here you can see what I'm talking about. I'm using a sanding block held parallel to the surface of the body, and because I have filler out into the body, I'm able to slowly sand down to the shape I need, always keeping parallel to the surface I'm working on. Once I'm close with the block sanding, I move on to hand sanding, making sure to use long strokes. I'll repeat this process many times, every coat the same way, filling the entire area so when sanding, I don't create depressions or waves. And I stay parallel to the surface so I follow the lines of the body and don't create new ones. This is how I create that finished look that appears as though it was always that way. Around curves, I try to keep the strokes long to avoid creating waves. By hand, I blend the fender flares into the body lines. With some patience, I was able to get a nice formed fender flare, but now it's time I turn my attention to the cutout itself. And I'll start by simply cutting away some of the styrene I can get to with scissors. This gives me a nice notch I can use to get in with a sanding drum. Again, staying short of the final shape. Here's a trick you can use. The edge of an X-Acto blade is a quick way to remove material with control. Then I finish by hand sanding. The cutout is complete. Now as before, I need to fill it, sand it into shape. And that's the job done. I'll give it a coat of primer. We'll take a final look.